Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our virtual event. I am Andrew I. Cohen. I am the director of the Jean Beer Blumenfeld Center for Ethics here at Georgia State University, where I also teach in the philosophy department. The Ethics Center today is delighted to bring to our community today's event, which is going to be talking about the best way to participate, which limbs we should use, vote with our hands or vote with our feet, a panel discussion. This is the sixth of our multi-part fall series on ethics and the 2020 elections. In each installment, we bring together noted speakers to campus virtually. Our events are designed to foster constructive dialogue and reflection about how ethics impacts the choices that we make as citizens and as human beings. This series is looking especially at how ethics matters for our ballot choices and for shaping election policy. And we're particularly eager to reflect on how ethics of elections matters for historically marginalized communities. There are further details about this series that are available from our website, ethics.gsu.edu. This series is made possible with the generous support of our co-sponsors, Georgia Humanities and the GSU Center for Human Rights and Democracy. We also thank our campus partners in making this event possible, the Panthers Vote Coalition, the Office of Civic Engagement, the Center for Studies on Africa and its Diaspora, the Department of Philosophy, the Center for Law, Health, and Society, and the GSU program in philosophy, politics, and economics. As people gear up to vote in the upcoming elections, many commentators say this is among the most momentous elections in U.S. history. They urge people to cast their vote. They get out the vote message is a very persistent message, and we hear it from politicians, from activists, even from comedians. Trevor Noah is speaking of this. And we frequently hear it from our friends, our family, and our colleagues. There is an unstated assumption that actual voting, using our hands to pull levers or to mark boxes on a ballot, this is the best, if not the only way, for us to secure important political interests. Critics, however, question the meaning or the significance of the ballot. They sometimes worry that an individual's vote is politically inconsequential, and to the extent that it matters at all, the vote matters unequally. So, for instance, thinking of the vote for president in states such as Alabama or California, the result seems a foregone conclusion, and a vote there for president seems to count for less than one in states such as Pennsylvania or Nevada, and perhaps increasingly Georgia, where the results might seem to be more of a toss-up. If one's political interests are sufficiently important, but they're insecure or inconsequential in one's current community, well, maybe you should leave. There are critics who warn that this talk that suggests perhaps you should relocate to a different jurisdiction, these critics will warn that this talk dangerously misses the significance of political participation, and especially for politically marginalized communities. These critics may say that better securing the vote, especially for persons in marginalized communities, where they are, in their communities, in their neighborhoods, that may seem to be a more respectful and a more reliable route to political stability and guaranteeing important liberties. Leaving a community seems like an unusual way to secure one's interests, and it might even be difficult for those who lack the resources to do so. But this has been a frequent feature of history, where people alone or with families seek out new opportunities in different lands. Now, no doubt people can and surely may do this, but we can take a step back today and ask, is it best for people to do so? Is it best for experts and policymakers to advocate it as an option? So today we are taking a step back from the rough and tumble of the upcoming vote, and we're going to take the election season as a springboard to think about some enduring issues. let us consider whether people can and sometimes should leave their home, leave their community to secure political interests. Perhaps they should vote with their feet. Now, this might seem like a surrender. It might seem instead that voting with your hands and in place with renewed attention to political participation and fairness, maybe that seems to be the best way to secure key political liberties and ensure political accountability. Our speakers today, to whom we are grateful that they are sharing their time, they're going to help us with a constructive conversation about these themes. Joining us today are three experts and scholars on political theory. Professor Ilya Somin, who is professor of law at George Mason University, Professor Andre Gillespie, who is associate professor of political science at Emory, and Professor Michael Evans, who joins us today from GSU's own Department of Political Science. You can read about our panelists further in the brochure for today's event, which you can find at the website for the Jean Beer Blumenfeld Center for Ethics, which is at ethics.gsu.edu. The format for today's event will be as follows. Each panelist will offer roughly 10 or so minutes of remarks, and then there will be a conversation among the panelists, and we will then draw on questions from attendees. So we encourage y'all to submit questions in the Q&A box, and we will harvest from those and relay that to the conversation among the panelists. We're going to begin with our first panelist, Professor Ilya Somin. Professor Somin is professor of law at George Mason University. His research focuses on several topics, including constitutional law, property law, democratic theory, and migration. Professor Somin has been published multiple times. He has published dozens of scholarly articles in respected journals and law reviews, and he has authored 6 books on topics such as political ignorance, eminent domain, healthcare, the Russian Revolution, and most recently, with Oxford University Press, Free to Move, Foot Voting, Migration, and Political Freedom. In some ways, Professor Somin's history is a bit of a poster child for our panel today, because Professor Somin's parents left the USSR and brought him to the United States when he was 5. You can read more about him at the brochure for today's event on our website at ethics.gsu.edu. And today, Professor Somin will discuss some key themes from his recent book. Professor, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you to the audience for attending this event, and to my co-panelists for what I know will be their very thoughtful and insightful remarks. The theme of my book, just published just a couple months ago by Oxford University Press, is that we should empower more people to vote with their feet. It is not necessarily my argument that everybody should always be on the brink of moving or should actually do so. Rather, my argument is that we should empower people with the opportunity to do so to a much greater extent than is currently the case for many, and that in several important ways, voting with your feet has significant advantages over ballot box voting. The point, I think, is not that ballot box voting should be abolished, but that its limitations can be dealt with by increasing opportunities for people to vote with their feet. Start off by briefly talking about what are the advantages of voting with your feet over ballot box voting. Then I'll talk about the 3 types of foot voting, which I hope to expand, that I advocate the expansion of in my book, which are foot voting within a federal system, when you choose where to live in a different state or locality based on government policies. Foot voting in the private sector, a less familiar concept that I will explain a bit later. And finally, the most controversial type, foot voting through international migration. So first things first, why should we even want to expand foot voting, given that for most people, we assume that the way we express political choice is in fact at the ballot box, or nowadays often by voting by mail. And I think voting at the ballot box or by mail has important value, but it has 2 very severe limitations. The first is that the chance that your vote will make a difference is infinitesimally small. On average, in a presidential election for most Americans, it's about 1 in 60 million. If you live in a swing state, as Georgia now is, it might be as high as 1 in 1 million or so, but it's still extremely low odds. In most contexts, we would not say you have meaningful freedom of choice if your chance of making a difference is 1 in 60 million or even 1 in 1 million. We would not say you have meaningful religious freedom if you have only a 1 in 1 million chance of being able to determine what faith you're going to practice or whether you want to practice one at all. We wouldn't say you have meaningful freedom of speech if you have only a 1 in 1 million chance of being able to determine what opinions you're allowed to express. And similarly, I would say that you don't have much in the way of meaningful political choice if you, in fact, have only a 1 in 1 million chance of being able to determine what government policies you are going to live under. This problem of the extremely low odds of making a difference also leads to the second problem, which is that most voters have little or no incentive to acquire more than a tiny amount of knowledge about the issues that they're working on or that they're voting on. In my previous book, Democracy and Political Ignorance, and to some degree in this book as well, I go through the extensive evidence indicating that most of the public has very little knowledge of the issues at stake in elections or even the basic structure of the political system. For example, only about 1/3 of Americans can even name the 3 branches of the federal government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. Similarly, most don't know such basic things as what the federal government spends its money on or which government officials are responsible for which issues. This is not because the voters are stupid, some of them may be, but in most cases, it's actually perfectly rational behavior. Because the chance your vote will make a difference is so low, there's very little payoff to spending more than the minimum amount of time seeking out information about the issues you're voting on. And this, of course, leads to ignorant voting and to many severely flawed government policies. It played a big role in Trump's victory in the 2016 election, where he very effectively exploited political ignorance about many issues. But one should be under no illusion that this problem is unique to one election or to one particular politician, no matter how egregious that individual might be. Quote unquote, normal politicians use these same sorts of tactics to a large extent as well, even if to a somewhat lesser degree than we see in some of the worst cases as Trump in 2016. Foot voting has important advantages on both dimensions. When you choose where to live, whether in a state or federal system or through international migration, if you're allowed to make the choice at all, then it's a choice that will actually have a high chance of making a difference. Similarly, for that very reason, there are much stronger incentives to acquire relevant knowledge. If you're like most people, you probably spent more time and effort the last time you decided what smartphone to get or what television set to buy than the last time you decided who to vote for president or for any other political office. That's not because your television set deals with more complicated issues than the president does, or that it's more important than the policies under the president's control. It's that you know that the TV you choose probably will actually be the one that ends up in your living room. But if you turn on the TV and you have the misfortune to see the president or some other politician or office holder, you know that the likelihood that you can affect who that is infinitesimally small, so you devote much less time and effort to that decision. I'd like to now take a closer look at the 3 different types of foot voting. First and most commonly thought of is foot voting in a federal system. This offers potentially many options to people. In the US, we have 50 states and almost 90,000 local or regional governments of various kinds. This offers a lot of alternatives and a much richer set of choices than exists simply in a 2-party system where you can either vote red or vote blue, even if often you don't like important elements of both parties' sets of policies. Moreover, historically, it has been especially the poor and the disadvantaged that have most been able to take advantage of foot voting and that have benefited from it the most. It's been a primary vehicle of mobility for the poor in terms of increasing their incomes. It has enabled groups like African Americans, women, gays, and lesbians, and others to escape oppression and injustice in parts of the country that were especially hostile to them. And there's a wide range of other benefits that I go into in greater detail in the book. I do acknowledge, of course, that there are important obstacles to effective foot voting, particularly in recent years. In the book, I present proposals for cutting down or eliminating those obstacles. The biggest example nowadays is exclusionary zoning, which artificially inflates the price of housing in many places and thereby prices the poor and even sometimes the lower middle class out of housing markets in places where they could otherwise seek jobs, opportunity, and other advantages. There are also a number of other obstacles that I discuss more fully in the book as well, and would be happy to talk about in a discussion and questions. A second type of foot voting, which may be less familiar, is foot voting in the private sector. We often don't even think of this as a matter of choice over policy at all. However, in fact, there are many private institutions that provide goods and services similar to those that are normally provided by state or local governments. The biggest example is private planned communities, such as condominium associations and others. Already over 70 million Americans or so live in such organizations, and the data suggests they provide a broader diversity of choice than state and local governments do. And moving costs are lower because we can fit more private planned communities in a given area than we can fit state or even local governments. The usual objection made against these is that it's only the rich that can do this. It's the rich walling themselves off from the rest of society. Even in the status quo, that isn't true. We don't have 70 million rich people in the US unless you have a very expansive definition of who counts as wealthy. But I do recognize that this form of organization is currently less available to the poor than to others. And I present various ideas for making it more easily available. The same is true for many other types of private sector institutions that can serve as an alternative to various kinds of government services. These include private school choice, various religious and civil society organizations, and many, many others. I discuss some of these in the book and also discuss ways to make them more available. It is not my claim that private sector organizations can fully displace public sector ones, or for that matter, that state or local governments can fully displace the federal government. But I do argue that we can decentralize power both to the local and state level and to private organizations much more fully than is currently the case. Many of the best government places in the world are small nations like New Zealand, Switzerland, Denmark, and others. If these societies can have their own healthcare policies, their own education policies, their own law enforcement, and so forth, the same is true of American states and even localities, many of which have populations of comparable or greater size than these countries that I just mentioned. So there's a lot of room for improvement here, even though we probably can't make it completely perfect. The final type of foot voting that I would like to talk about is, I think, the most controversial: foot voting through international migration. And here there are the greatest possible gains because the differences between national governments are much larger in many cases than any differences within countries. Think of whatever you think is the best governed American state and compare it to whatever you think is the worst. It's probably a pretty big difference, but it's still very small compared to the difference between the US and Mexico, or the US and Cuba, or the US and China. When people move from these oppressive societies to the US or another freer nation, they right away have massive gains in every conceivable dimension of human freedom, and also in their options for political choice. Moreover, about 1/3 of the world's population lives under dictatorships of various kinds. For these people, foot voting through international migration is virtually the only option they conceivably have to exercise any kind of political choice at all. I would also note that with both expanding internal foot voting and expanding international migration, there are enormous economic gains to be had. If we had complete freedom of movement throughout the world, if all migration restrictions were abolished, economists estimate world GDP would double. The world would be twice as wealthy as it currently is. And that's because so many millions of people are currently trapped under governments that are so oppressive or so flawed and corrupt that no matter how hardworking those people are, how smart they are, they have little or no chance of ever escaping poverty or becoming productive. When such people are allowed to move to freer societies, they almost immediately become vastly more productive. And that doesn't even take account of the fact that they can improve their skills over time, which is usually more feasible to do in a freer and wealthier society than the places where they come from. Despite these enormous gains, there are obviously a whole range of objections to expanded migration rights. I don't have time to go over them all here, but I'll just mention two categories of objections. One is claims that current national governments have an inherent right to exclude people, either because there's a particular type of ethnic group or racial group, there's the quote unquote, the true owners of the area in question, or because a nation is like a house or a club and therefore has the right to exclude people, just as a private homeowner, for example, can exclude people from their house. There's also a second category of objections, which are about specific policy issues, which say, well, we should be able to exclude people because they might overburden the welfare state, or if they vote, they might vote for bad government policies or other effects of this type. I'll just very briefly give a preview of my answers to these sorts of arguments. On the racial and ethnic argument, there are many flaws with this one, but the biggest one is that it's a license for racial and ethnic discrimination more generally. In a domestic sphere, we readily acknowledge that it's wrong and unjust to have something like apartheid in South Africa or racial segregation in the US, where you're allowed to live depends on who your parents are and what your race or ethnicity is. If this is wrong at a domestic level, I see no reason why it isn't also wrong on the international level. On the house or club analogy, again, there are a great many flaws in this kind of argument. I'll just mention one. If you take it seriously, it has dire implications, not just for migrants, but also for natives. Consider that the owner of a private house can say, I will only allow in my house that political speech that I agree with, only Republican speech or only Democratic speech. Similarly, I can say the only religion that can be practiced in my house is the one that I approve of. Christianity, Islam, what have you. And the same is true of a private club. You can have a Muslim club, a Christian club, a Republican club, and so forth. So if you take seriously the idea that a government should have the same powers as the residents, as the owners of a private home or private club members, then it has very negative implications. It's essentially a justification for a totalitarian state. On the more specific policy issues, I go through many of these in the book in great detail. Here, I'll just mention my general framework for addressing them. First, ask how big a problem is this really? Often it's not much of a problem at all. Second, if there is a real problem, might there not be a keyhole solution that can address it, a way of dealing with the issue without actually excluding people? For instance, if the problem is overburdening the welfare state, we can simply limit immigrants' eligibility for welfare. And finally, if there is a problem and there is no keyhole solution, we can tap the vast wealth created by extra migration to address some possible negative side effects. And there are many ways to do that that I discuss in the book. The very last point that I will make is that these objections, they're usually raised, at least today, primarily against international migration. But if you take them seriously, they would justify imposing severe limits on internal freedom of movement as well. If you think that a nation is like a house or a club, why can't Texas or Virginia or Georgia also be a house or a club? If you think we can restrict Mexicans from moving to the US for fear that they will overburden the welfare state, we could similarly say that people from poor American states shouldn't be allowed to move to wealthy ones. And similarly, if you think that Mexicans might come in and vote for bad political candidates, well, West Virginians could move to Virginia and vote for bad candidates in Virginia elections, so that same objection can apply. And the same thing is true of nearly all of the standard objections to expanded international migration. If in the domestic sphere, we say either these problems are overblown or we can handle them by less draconian means, I would say the same thing is true in the vast majority of instances for international migration. I'll stop there, but I look forward to discussion and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Somin. Next up is Emory University's Dr. Andre Gillespie. Dr. Gillespie is Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute for the Study of Race and Difference at Emory University here in Atlanta. Dr. Gillespie's research has focused on political leadership in a post-civil rights era. Her work has been published in numerous academic journals. Among her publications are also some books, including The New Black Politician, Cory Booker, Newark, and Post-Racial America, as well as in 2019, Race and the Obama Administration, Symbols, Substance, and Hope. Dr. Gillespie also writes and speaks regularly about issues at the intersection of faith and politics. Dr. Gillespie has appeared regularly in notable media outlets, including on Atlanta TV and nationally with CNN and NPR. She has been published in several distinguished outlets such as The Washington Post and Politico. You can read a bit more about her in the brochure for today's event at ethics.gsu.edu. Today, Dr. Gillespie will discuss why symbolic politics matters and why that is important for voting. Dr. Gillespie, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you to my panelists. I'm going to modify my comments in regard to Professor Somin's talk, and I hope that this generates a big discussion. So the theme of today's panel is voting with one's hands or one's feet. And so the preview of where I'm going to get to is that I believe that you vote with both and that those are important for both symbolic and substantive reasons. And so I'm going to, think about that and unpack that a little bit more, but I do also want to think about what I mean when I say that people vote with their feet. While I understand where Professor Somin is coming from, and I don't disagree that one absolutely can vote with their feet, I think that the conception of the feet is actually a little bit different. And so I want to elaborate on that here. And so as I was listening to Professor Somin's talk, I was very much interested by the sort of implications of thinking about what we call pivotality in the study of political participation. And so pivotality is the notion that one could play the pivotal role in determining the outcome of an election. And Professor Somin is correct. Most people don't play that decisive vote in an election, but we can think about instances where there are people who might not be the one who plays the decisive role, but we could think about those 523 votes in Florida in 2000, or those 77,000 votes that were distributed across Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania in 2016, to know that there are small numbers of people who could play a very important outcome in sort of determining the course of an election. So it's really important for us to think about what the role of the vote is, what it does do and what it doesn't do, and then also thinking about the other factors that predict a person's likelihood of participating in an election. And so one of the things that really kind of came to mind as Professor Somin was talking was the work of people who kind of were working early in rational choice and economic models of political participation. So I'm thinking of people like Anthony Downs and Riker and Ordershuk, and in particular, I want to look at the model that was developed from Downs and that was expanded upon by Riker and Ordershuk in the 1960s that really tries to explain why people vote and why they don't. So the economists do agree that voting really isn't always the most rational activity for some of the reasons that Professor Somin laid out. In particular, most people don't actually sort of play that key vote in an election where they're going to determine whether somebody wins or loses. But that's not the only factor that can determine a person's likelihood of turning out to vote. Pivotality is certainly one of the variables that we consider, but we also consider whether or not the election, whether or not the respondent, whether or not the individual voter actually cares about the outcome of the election. And we also think about the costs that are inherent to voting. So whether we're talking about the time it takes to look at candidates and to study up on the issues versus the cost it takes to actually cast a ballot, the time it takes for one to register to vote, the time that it takes to go to a polling place, the time that it takes to stand online, even basic costs of voting, like if you have to put a stamp on an absentee ballot, right? That's a cost. There's an opportunity cost that's there because you can't use that 50 cents for something else later on. So these are all important. But one of the sort of innovations of the Riker and Ordershuk model was to add this variable that is in its sort of numeric term sort of coded as D. And so D is intangible. D is this idea that people are going to derive some type of psychic benefit from participating in the process. And that actually is going to outweigh the high costs of voting, which almost certainly outweigh the cost of one's interest in the election and the likelihood of their playing a pivotal role in determining the outcome of a race. And so D can mean many things. D could be mobilization by outside groups and influential people. D could be the type of sort of civic value that has been inculcated through classes or through family. C could be the idea that one feels like they are holding their elected officials accountable by participating in the process. There are many things that could contribute to D. We often focus on political mobilization, but I think it's just important to put into context that if it were all about whether or not you're going to cast the deciding vote, I wouldn't have cast a deciding vote in an election personally, since I voted myself cheerleading captain like back in the 90s. So there's more to it. And so the reason why people vote is because they're getting other benefits from it. And we have to acknowledge those benefits. And I think that that actually ties into my critique, if you will, of Professor Somin's call for people to move across the country. And one of the things that I should note is that there are many people who actually agree with this. There was actually an interesting debate on Twitter a couple of weeks ago involving a really close friend of mine at Princeton, who was suggesting that Democrats should move to various red states and to try to change the electoral outcomes in some of those states. And while I agree, yeah, people can move, and by moving, we could hasten the types of demographic shifts that could change red states blue and blue states red. Right. The reality is that we also have to think about other factors that compel people to move. And so many of the excellent factors that Professor Somin lay out are certainly important. Trying to, escape religious or cultural oppression, seeking economic opportunity, other kinds of things. But there are also these really other important and tangible factors. So, whether one is getting on the proverbial midnight train to Georgia, because you want to return to something that's more familiar to you, or you want to go back to an existing social or familial network, whether you like the community that you live in because you have really close friends and neighbors, whether you like the climate. It's just not practical for people to always move across the country, and there are other reasons that hold people back, and we have to acknowledge that. And so for most of us, the task is going to be staying where we are, planting our feet firmly on the ground, and seeing if we could try to work together with other people to make the best of the communities in which we live. So how do we do that? I argue that voting with one's hands, participating in the formal electoral process, is a starting place to do that. So here is why we look at voting as kind of the starting place for a democratic discussion. First of all, the franchise is the marker of full citizenship in the United States. So when people don't have voting rights, then we know that they aren't fully accepted as citizens, even if there are other ways that we can test markers of citizenship and test markers of full social and political equality. That's a baseline. So if we think about the long civil rights movement of the mid-20th century, the right for voting rights was inherent there, right? Because it was one of those rights of citizenship that proved that Blacks weren't slaves anymore and that they were being treated on equal footing with their white counterparts. And so this is why it is so important. It is why it was so important now 100 years after the passage of the 19th Amendment that we see women, particularly white women, wanting to get the right to vote because it gave them political status that was going to be the equivalent of their male counterparts. So it's important, but it's not the be all end all. It is a starting place. It's a starting place for a number of reasons. One, if we look at voting within the panoply of other types of political participation, right, it stands out as somewhat low cost and pretty ubiquitous, right? It doesn't mean that it's no cost, right? So we've already outlined the costs of voting. But it is a baseline entry level for people to start to become full citizens in a society. And yes, there are inherent inequalities. So if you live in a heavily gerrymandered district where the outcome of a race has been determined, right, you probably won't have the same impact on the vote, right, because it's already been rigged. If you are participating in a presidential election in the Electoral College and you live in a big state like New York or Texas or California, right, your vote doesn't count as much as somebody who lives in, a Wyoming or another small state like Alaska, for instance, where there's a smaller population, right? But those are institutional biases that are inherent and that are reflected even in other institutions like the U.S. Senate. And we can talk about how to fix those later and what kinds of things have been proposed in order to do that. But voting is the first thing that one can do, and it's the first place where elected officials go to get any information about what citizen preferences are. So if you don't participate in that process, you're not actually starting the conversation with elected officials. And in some ways, you're not holding those people accountable, because it is through the ballot that we actually give certain people power, where we delegate authority to certain people to make decisions on our behalf. And so whether or not we participate in the process, the people people who do participate in the process are going to pick people who are going to make decisions, and they're going to feel completely justified in doing that. So what we have to do is to consider, well, what else do we have to do? So I think we can take two prongs here. One of the things that we can do is we can figure out how to reform the system so that we can make everybody's vote count, to make it as equal as it is allegedly in the 15th Amendment or even in the 14th Amendment. So there are other reforms that perhaps we should consider. So for instance, should we let partisans draw their own district lines when trying to create state legislative or congressional districts? Perhaps not, and perhaps we should have a serious discussion in this state and in many others about nonpartisan district drawing to perhaps draw district lines that make sense from a geographic or industrial standpoint, and that certainly don't take things like race and party identification into account in determining who should be able to represent these particular districts. There should be a conversation on the table about what to do with the Electoral College. The noted political scientist, the late Robert Dahl, noted that the Electoral College was created as a bit of an afterthought. And so maybe there is a room to be able to sort of modify that. And so there are certain things that are on the table. Ratification of the abolition of the Electoral College doesn't seem likely because small states wouldn't ratify it. They already get benefit too much from it. But there are other states that have tried or are considering other measures, like as soon as a majority of states agree to this, changing the Electoral College vote so that it's pegged to the national popular vote as opposed to the statewide popular vote. So there are other things to consider. I'm not advocating any of these policies either way, but it's worth discussing them. One of the other ways that we can amplify our importance in elections is recognizing that elections take place more often than November of leap years, and not just even November in even numbered years. There are elections that take place all the time. Often people don't know about them because they're not very well publicized, and intentionally so, because there are elected officials who have incentives to keep the electorate small for small races like T-SPLOSTs or school board races and other types of local elections where they may not want everybody participating because they don't really want to be accountable to the full electorate. And so maybe we need to think about election reforms that will standardize and make it easier for people to understand when elections are being held so that you don't have 5 different elections 6 times a year and runoffs at weird times and other kinds of things. So related to this is also what the limitations of voting are. And so a vote is a blunt instrument in terms of its communicative power. So we know that if somebody casts a ballot today or tomorrow or on Tuesday for Joe Biden or Donald Trump, that it's going to convey certain messages. So depending on which one of them wins the election, they are going to infer that all of the people who voted for them, that translated into all the Electoral College votes, gave them a mandate to do everything that they promised. But what if you voted for Joe Biden because you supported his policy for addressing COVID, but you don't support his policy on energy? What if you voted for Donald Trump because you like the advances in the stock market up until the pandemic, but you disagree with his policies on policing and toward race in general? How are these candidates and elected officials supposed to know what you meant by your vote? And so that's one of the limitations of voting, is that elected officials often infer a mandate from elections that's not actually there. And so that means that as citizens, we have to remember that our job as U.S. citizens is a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week job, that it doesn't just start and end on election days and leap years, but rather we're supposed to come back and we're also supposed to convey our preferences through communicating regularly with our elected officials. So that could be in benign ways like sending emails and writing letters to our elected officials, requesting meetings with them, appearing at public hearings, especially at the local level, and making remarks in the comments section portion of the meeting. But it could also be using our feet and our First Amendment right to assembly in order to engage in protests, to be very clear about what people want and about what their preferences are. And so I view sort of the notion of voting with one's feet as the notion of engaging in the full citizenship process, where you use the ballot for what it is intended for, but you also figure out other ways to communicate one's policy preferences more clearly to elected officials, and you seek to hold them accountable, not just by calling them out publicly, but also being willing to vote them out of office by using that formal power of the franchise. And so here's how this actually ties into sort of our notions of understanding symbolism and substance. There's been a lot of discussion lately about the candidates and about, some of the activities that they've gained in that don't necessarily seem to be very rooted in substance. Or we could talk about the party's history in terms of treating certain communities with kid gloves or not actually taking the concerns of those communities seriously. And I don't want to discount the importance of those critiques, because I think those critiques are in fact very real. But I think it's also important to realize that some of the substantive behavior that these candidates are engaging in is actually really powerful. So what does it mean that Joe Biden was responsive to the concerns that were raised by African-American activists within the Democratic Party to give Black women a bigger voice in the party, to recognize the importance of their vote to the Democratic Party coalition? I would argue that that's actually much more important than just sort of the face value of having Kamala Harris on the ticket. And it has the chance to have reverberations for years going forward in terms of how it creates the way to pave networks for other women of color to follow her into high positions of leadership. Similarly, what does it mean when you see Donald Trump standing with a Bible, near the White House as people are protesting the killing of Black bodies, right? It sends this very dissonant and discordant message about what President Trump thinks about race relations, right? That confirms what many people believe about him, which I personally would believe to be true. But also, it also sought to undermine the parts of the Trump record where we do have to contend with improvements that took place in Black communities, right? And so when President Trump wanted to make certain types of claims about what he had done for African Americans, it got muddled because of the symbolism that was in fact very substantive of some of the racist actions and comments that he made. And I think we also need to take those seriously. So I can't separate symbolism from substantive activity because they're often tied together and they are able to enhance a program or they're actually able to undermine that program. So in conclusion, what does that mean for us? I think it means that we have to take an all hands on deck approach. And I think that also means that we can't sort of just sit back and lie idly sort of behind thinking dogmatically that, we don't find candidates who are as ideologically pure as we are, then we're justified in our right not to engage with them as elected officials or engage with them through the electoral process. No candidate is perfect. No party is perfect. No election is perfect. And so we could give up and justify it and rationalize it in philosophical ways, or we could actually seek to get what we can from processes, seek to actually sort of have moments where we can persuade each other of the righteousness of our cause, and then continue to work together to at least make some gains that give us a platform so that we can fight for other gains in the future. So I'll stop there.
Thank you for those remarks, Dr. Gillespie. Our third panelist today is GSU's own Professor Michael Evans. Dr. Evans is lecturer in the Political Science Department at Georgia State University. Dr. Evans's work has been funded by several foundations, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to study the intersection of technology and adaptive learning methods. Dr. Evans writes and speaks regularly on themes in pedagogy and politics, including in his book, Understanding the American Way of Government and Politics. Evans is a leader here on campus and in the community, advising the Pre-Law Society, the Mock Trial Team, the Vote Everywhere at GSU group, and other campus and community engagements. Dr. Evans has also published on topics in American politics, property rights, and jurisprudence. Today, Dr. Evans will make a case for voting with hands, and partly in response to some of the themes from Professor Somin's book. Dr. Evans, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you to my co-panelists. I also want to thank Donna Hardaway for all the work that she clearly does behind the scenes. And I have to say, this is I've attended all but one of the panels, so thank you for this entire series. It's really been a lot of fun to attend. So the title of this panel is Foot Voting versus Ballot Voting, and as Andrew said, I'm going to be talking and making the case for ballot voting. And I'm really going to focus on kind of the empirical evidence for why democracy and voting promotes human rights and human welfare. But first, I want to talk a little bit about this dichotomy between foot voting and ballot voting. The first thing is for me, kind of like Professor Gillespie, I see no real conflict between my strong belief in the importance of ballot voting and foot voting. Thank goodness Professor Somin and his family were able to leave the oppressive situation that they found themselves in the Soviet Union in the 1970s, that they could move to a democratic country that was prosperous and somewhat free. Thank goodness, for another example, and there's endless examples, but millions of African Americans who were in the Jim Crow South were able to use foot voting to escape that situation and go to northern states where there was still, of course, rampant racism and racial injustice, but they were able to go there to exercise their right to vote, to run for office, and to enjoy a great deal more protection for their basic human rights by being able to exercise the right of exit. And I'll say, after having had the pleasure of reading Professor Somin's, at least the first 4 chapters of Professor Somin's book, still working my way through it, I'm even more convinced that our country, we need to be doing more to open our borders for refugees that are trying to escape oppression around the world. We need to do more collectively to make this a country that people want to escape to. But for reasons I'll be discussing in my brief remarks today, I also believe strongly, as I said, in ballot voting. And in fact, I agree with Professor Gillespie, we need to not just do that, we need to do more to expand access to the vote. We need to improve our institutions around voting. This is a challenge that we face as a country that we really need to confront. Our democratic institutions are old and in many ways dysfunctional, and there's a lot of work we have to do to improve our democratic institutions. The second point I want to make about this dichotomy is that I think this framing of the issue, at least the way it's framed, in some ways kind of unfairly stacks the deck, and misleadingly even stacks the deck in favor of foot voting and away from ballot voting. As Professor Somin points out, one of the most appealing features of foot voting is that your choice is decisive. It's reliably decisive when you choose to move to a different location. And of course, but that's really because they aren't functionally equivalent. They aren't. It's not a functional substitute for voting. Voting is something we do because we have to reach a collective decision in our community that's binding upon all of us. The private decision to move does not result in a collectively binding decision that affects us all. And when we have accepted that there are certain collective decisions we have to make, like who are going to be our leaders in government over the next term, or ballot initiatives, or whatever it may be, when we decide we have to reach collective decisions, the case for voting is based on the idea that actually it's a good thing that my vote will not be decisive. If my vote were decisive, that would make me dictator over that collective decision. The basic case for voting emanates from the idea that none of us are in a position to dictate to the rest, and that there's no principled reason why one person's preference should weigh more than anybody else's. So we have to aggregate it somewhere, and there's all kinds of problems with different ways of aggregating, and there's no perfect way to aggregate. But that doesn't mean that an imperfect form of aggregation isn't preferable to giving certain people dictatorial power over decisions that are binding upon the whole community. And so for this reason, I think foot voting is more accurately labeled, as Albert Hirschman did famously in his book, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. He referred to it as exit, or the right of exit. It's not really, he didn't try to call it foot voting. In some ways you could say that, this is maybe a bit too flippant, but we could say that a resort to political violence is a form of bullet voting, right? Because there's a form of expressing preferences. Foot voting is just a very different thing from voting, and I think we lose something analytically if we conflate the two things. And that brings me to my second point, which is I think there was a reason that Hirschman, and this is basically a point that Professor Gillespie made really well, which is that Hirschman didn't call it exit voting and loyalty. He called it exit voice and loyalty. The point of staying here and exercising our democratic freedoms to try to collectively self-govern ourselves, to fight for our own rights and the rights of others. That's a broader set of processes, not just voting, right? So voting includes marching in the streets, publishing books and treatises, petitioning government, lobbying government, giving speeches, working for political parties, starting and participating in social movements, starting and contributing to advocacy groups, and engaging in nonviolent direct action campaigns. Certainly voting is a part of democratic voice, but it's only one part. I think this is a point that Professor Gillespie made really well. And I'd say that voting makes those other exercises of voice more powerful. And those other exercises of voice can make voting more powerful. And we have many examples where, in fact, it was exercises of non-voting forms of democratic voice that secured the right to vote. And arguably, we are in a situation today where we need to exercise those non-voting forms of voice in order to better secure the right to vote. So I'll say, thank goodness we don't only have so many examples of people using the right of exit to escape bad political situations and enter into bad ones, but also thank goodness we have so many examples of people who have stayed where they are and fought to improve their political situation. And here I just want to talk about a couple of prominent examples. One is Frederick Douglass, and Professor Somin, I was not aware until I read your book about the eloquent case that Frederick Douglass made for the right of exit for foot voting, the importance of migrating as a form of as a strategy for escaping oppression. But we know, of course, Frederick Douglass did not leave the United States. He actually at one point did almost leave the United States when he was frustrated by the Lincoln administration's failure to move more decisively towards ending slavery in the early parts of the Civil War. But he decided to stay. And in fact, when he moved to the North, he fought for abolition. He and others who had the right to vote in some states in the North used that voice and helped to elect Abraham Lincoln to the presidency. We can see complaints about that in some of the Southern secession ordinances. And when the Civil War was over, after he had used his powerful voice in part to persuade Lincoln and others to push for the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, he also pushed for the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment, giving the right to vote. Probably no one did more to fight for the right to vote in the Constitution than Frederick Douglass by not exiting, but by staying here and fighting for the rights of others. I already used the example of the Great Migration. It's highly unlikely that we would have seen the kind of bipartisan push for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, if not for the voting power of African Americans in the North after they migrated from the Jim Crow South and used the powerful vote to fight for the rights of others in other parts of the country. So that's another great example of staying here. That's like a combined example. They used the right of exit and foot voting, and then they used ballot box voting very powerfully. And we could come up with many, many other examples of those those in the civil rights movement, for example, who stayed here and fought. And so before explaining why I think voting itself is important, other examples, I want to make one last point about this. Over the last few years, I've had the honor of working with the Andra Goodman Foundation to create a program here at GSU called Vote Everywhere. And this involves having students work year-round in odd years and even years. It doesn't matter if it's presidential election year or midterm election year. These students work year-round on registering other students to vote, but also engaging in voter education, trying to inform other students about the importance of democracy, the importance of participation in democracy, and how to use how to vote responsibly. And it's been probably, I'd say, watching that program be such a success and impact so many of my students' lives and those in our community, I'd say it's been one of the most rewarding things in my professional career. But I'd like for us to reflect for a minute on Andrew Goodman himself. This is the Andrew Goodman Foundation. It's named after it was started by his family. Andrew Goodman used exit in a very different way. Andrew Goodman lived a comfortable middle-class life in New York, and he believed strongly that the right to vote is a powerful instrument for protecting human rights, a powerful instrument for promoting general welfare, and to deny people that right, as I'm sure everybody on this panel and everybody in attendance today would agree, denying people that right is a very bad thing, is a terrible injustice. And he believed so strongly that he left. He used exit to go down in and join the fight in Mississippi. And he paid, along with Michael Schwimmer and James Chaney, paid the ultimate sacrifice. He was murdered by the KKK because of his efforts to try to register other people to vote and help them to be able to exercise the franchise. And a question I ask myself often, I've met Andrew Goodman's brother through my involvement in this, and something I've asked myself is, was it in vain? Was it worth it? Was the sacrifice for the vote for others, was it something that was worthwhile? And I believe strongly, I don't know, I'd never say that somebody should have given up their life for something else, but I will say that I believe that we're all better off, those who there's been huge benefits from the sacrifices made to protect the vote, and not just by those three, but countless others. I want to talk about one other person, somebody who also didn't use the right of exit, who also didn't vote with his feet, but decided to stay and fight for his own rights, but the rights of others, and that's John Lewis. John Lewis said, this is a quote from a few years ago at a commencement address. He said, "I say to each and every one of you, in the best way that I can, I gave a little blood on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, but some people gave their lives for the right to vote. The vote is precious. It is the most powerful nonviolent tool we have in a democratic society, and we must use it. Vote. The vote is powerful," said John Lewis. And what is it, though? And that's the question that Professor Somin has invited us to ask. Is the vote powerful? The most powerful case for foot voting is that, again, at least as an individual, you're going to have a lot more control over the outcome if you vote with your feet than if you vote with the ballot. But I want to, just as Professor Gillespie outlined, the vote is powerful when combined with other forms of democratic voice. And there's a saying in politics that I think really helps with this. Is the idea that if you're not at the table, you're likely on the menu. And we now need to we need to qualify this. Unless you leave the restaurant, then you're not how you can exit and then you can escape it. But for those of us that stay in the restaurant, who stay here, if you're not at the table, you're likely on the menu. And we have abundant evidence that if you don't participate, you don't make your voice heard, then your rights are likely to be threatened, and your interests are not going to be reflected in public policy. You don't need to be highly knowledgeable to vote and for voting to be a good thing. The point of voting, in fact, it's not that voters are the ones making the decisions and they need to be highly valuable. The point is for voters to make their interests and their rights and concerns known to those who do make the decisions. The question of the case for democracy is not based on the knowledge of the voters or the incentives that voters face. The case for democracy, at least in a representative democracy, is what it allows our elected officials to know and what incentives they face. And what we see is that governments are far more responsive to the interests and rights of voters, of people who are enfranchised, people who use the right to vote. One other quote that's also for some reason based on eating is by Barney Frank, who said, when as a member of Congress, he said that elected officials pay as much attention to the dietary preferences, elected officials pay as much attention to those who are unregistered or inactive at voting as butchers do to the dietary preferences of vegetarians. But Barney Frank was saying, and Frank claimed that he as an elected official actually looked, if somebody wrote him or somebody came and tried to protest and tried to do a sit-in near his office, he actually looked up to see, do they register to vote? Are they registered? Do they actually vote? He claimed. He said they're going to be more likely to listen to you if you demonstrate a willingness to vote. Now, it's not because your one vote is powerful, but because you are a threat to them. You possibly could lead others to go out and vote. You could be a part or the leader of a social movement, of a block of voters who are going to go and make that and potentially vote that person out of office. It's not a solitary act. When you combine it with other forms of voice, it can be a very powerful thing. So that's suggestive of what the mechanism might be. But regardless of what the mechanism is, There's abundant political science research that our rights and interests are better secured when we live in a democracy or if we vote rather than don't vote. And I wish this information were more out there. Professor Somin, I know in your book, you keep citing the book, The Democratic Advantage, when you try to make the point that, yeah, I'm okay with voting, but that's one book. I want to add some things that in your later work, perhaps, that you can add to your list of references for making the case for democracy and making the case for voting. And I'm not going to do the citations, so I'm happy to provide them. But we have published empirical research by political scientists showing that democracies are more likely to protect the human rights written in their constitutions than are non-democracies. One of the best predictors of whether a country actually follows the human rights protections in their constitution is if they're a democracy or not. The other is an independent judiciary. Those two variables are the only predictors that a government will follow the human rights protections that are written in their constitutions. Democracies are less likely to kill their own people. Rudolf Rummel, in his book, Death by Government, demonstrated that in the 20th century, 175 million people, at least conservatively estimating, 175 million people were killed by their own governments through democide, which was 4 times the number of people who were killed in wars in a very bloody 20th century. 99% by Rummel's estimate, 99% of those killings took place in non-democratic countries, the majority of which were committed by 3 regimes that were particularly brutal: People's Republic of China, the Soviet Union, and Nazi Germany. But nearly all death examples that we have of mass death by government were in non-democracies. We have abundant empirical evidence that stable democracies are more likely than authoritarian governments to adopt policies that lead to economic prosperity and growth, promote the education and physical health of citizens, to intervene to prevent and relatively quickly address economic disasters, famines, financial crises, epidemics, and depressions. And on all these examples, if you say, what about the US? I would say, to Professor Gillespie's point earlier, we aren't very democratic right now in the United States. But even after accounting for the fact that democracies tend to promote high levels of economic prosperity, people who live in democracies on average live longer and healthier lives and attain higher levels of education than those who do not. If we're talking about actual impact of voting, we look at the impact on African Americans in the South after the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. We have several studies showing the following. It led to a substantial increase in the distribution of state government resources to predominantly Black communities, increases in Black employment and real wages, vast improvements in government services, including schools, fire protection, road maintenance, public transportation, and recreational facilities, substantial improvements in educational outcomes, and improvements in Black physical health, including increased life expectancy and reduced infant mortality rates. If we look at local politics, and if we compare across different localities and we look at turnout rates, Professors Zoltan Hajnal and Jessica Tunstein demonstrated that higher voting rates are more cities with higher voting rates are more representative and responsive to the interests and values of underprivileged citizens. For example, cities with higher than average voter turnout spend 25% more on programs that benefit the least advantaged citizens, such as public housing, health services, and education. Programs that increase youth voter turnout, that by encouraging pre-registration in high school, states that allow students to pre-register before they turn 18. We have published studies showing that not only did youth turnout increase, but so did spending on higher education in states that did that. Enfranchisement of women after the passage of the 19th Amendment led to increases in government spending on social welfare programs, particularly those focused on education and the health of mothers and children. One study estimates that increases in government health spending resulting from women's suffrage reduced child mortality by 8 to 15% and prevented 20,000 child deaths per year in the 1920s. Okay? And that's just a sampling of the studies that are out there that show us in a tangible way the impact of voting and the impact of democracy. I focus on those things not necessarily because those are the most important things to look at, but because they're tangible and measurable. Who knows what other ways our interests and values are better represented when we have it, when we have the vote and we use it, and especially when we live in a democracy rather than a non-democracy. All right, in closing, I just want to say that political scientists Suzanne Mittler and Robert Lieberman recently published a book called Four Threats: The Recurring Crisis of American Democracy. They point out that the state of democracy in America is constantly in flux, and that we've had recurrent backsliding throughout our history, including for about a 60-year period where one-party authoritarian rule was established in the South in the United States. It was not in any way. We had minority rule in the South during the Jim Crow era. People who say that was majority tyranny are wrong. It was minority as well as a system of racial apartheid. And so that was an example of democratic backsliding where democracy completely failed, where we completely lost democracy in the South. But we've had several recurrent crises in our history in the United States. We don't need to look abroad to see examples of democratic backsliding. We have many examples of it here in the United States. And what Mittler and Lieberman have shown is that there's four factors that seem to put us at the greatest risk of losing our democracy. They are polarization, high levels of economic inequality, white supremacist challenges to inclusive citizenship, and executive aggrandizement of power. And currently, this is the only time in American history where we have all four of those threats present. We have abundant evidence that our democracy is at risk. So I don't blame anyone, and you can look around, and I will say it's whatever the outcome of this election is, President Trump is voted out, the threat will continue. It's structural. It's not based on a particular individual. He's a product of this and not the cause of this, but although he has contributed to it as well. So I don't blame anyone for exercising their right of exit by foot voting in a time like now, but I plan to stay here to fight for our democracy, and I hope you'll join me.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Evans. Appreciate the remarks. So we have a few minutes remaining to field questions from attendees and also to have the panelists offer some remarks. So why don't we first turn to Professor Somin or Dr. Gillespie for a few thoughts, and then we can perhaps have enough time for one or two questions from the Q&A. Professor Somin. I might be muted.
Sorry, I forgot about the mute system. Thanks to other panelists for their thoughtful remarks. I just want to respond to just a few points. There are a lot of things they said that I agreed with, but there are also some obviously that I did not. One point I would like to emphasize is that much of the argument supposedly directed at me was actually an argument directed at a conclusion I was not arguing for. That is, I'm not arguing for replacing democracy with dictatorship or replacing democracy with the rule of a minority such as whites or wealthy people or men as opposed to women and so forth. That's why I cited the research in my book indicating that democracy is preferable to dictatorship or to oligarchy or whatnot, so that people would not be confused and would not think that that was my message. Rather, my point is that while it's wrong to have dictatorship and it's also bad to have invidious restrictions on the franchise based on race or ethnicity or gender, it's still better to have a system which is democratic, but where the power of democratic institutions is tightly limited in various ways so as to empower people to vote with their feet so they can really have a decisive choice over their fate in a way that under democratic voting, in most cases, most individuals cannot do that. And that leads to my next point. I do recognize there are other motivations to vote other than influencing the policies that you vote under, that you live under, such as symbolic motives of various kinds. However, being able to control the policies you live under is extremely important to almost every conception of political freedom out there. And it's something that even under the best possible functioning democracy, it's something that the individual voter either doesn't have at all or only has a 1 in a million chance or 1 in 1,000 chance or whatnot. Moreover, while it's true that expanding the franchise to various groups can help them protect their interests, it's also true that ignorant and flawed voting causes enormous harm, both to vulnerable minorities, but even to the majority that votes on the basis of ignorance for policies that seem plausible because they don't know much about their actual effects, but in reality cause great harm. In my previous book, Democracy and Political Ignorance, I give a number of examples of those, such as protectionism, restrictions on housing growth, and also many kinds of racial oppression and other kinds of oppression, which arose, including in democratic societies, in part because people were ignorant about the actual effects of different policies. White voters in many places, for instance, believe that there's a zero-sum game between them and certain racial minorities, or between them and immigrants. It's not true. The world isn't actually a zero-sum game, but the belief that it is motivated some very harmful policies. And therefore, while there's a cost to excluding people from the franchise on various unjust bases, there's also a high cost to ignorant voting. Both of the other panelists mentioned the issue of participation beyond voting, like protests, petitions, and many other kinds of things. I would note two things about this. One is these activities, as particularly if you want to do them effectively, are often much more costly than voting itself and require more knowledge. For that reason, the data show that a majority of Americans actually don't participate in these other activities almost at all because of their costs. But also, given the costs are unequally distributed, you could say, let's make it equal. In theory, you could do that. I discussed this possibility in the book. But then ironically, the participation beyond voting, the people who engage in it, if it was truly equal, they would have just as little chance of making a difference as they currently do at the ballot box. Talking about being a leader and organizing others, as Mike did, yes, you could do that, but that's only possible for you to have that large influence if, in fact, the influence is disproportionate. Finally, on collective versus other kinds of decisions, I think this sort of stacks the deck somewhat, because often what's really at stake is whether there should be a collective control over something or not. Should there be collective control over who I'm allowed to marry, where I'm allowed to live? Should there be collective control over what profession I'm allowed to enter, and other people as well, not just me? Often what the power of exit and foot voting does is it enables you to not accept that particular form of collective control. But the beauty of it is that unlike purely laissez-faire systems where you then eliminate the possibility of collective decisions, here you can have them, but you also can have choice between different kinds of collectivities, between different regional and local governments, and even between different nations. So you have the option of being somewhere where there's a collective choice over a particular policy area, but also the option of choosing between different kinds of collective choices and not merely having a 1 in a million chance of choosing between red versus blue, Trump versus Biden, and so forth. I also in the book discuss at great length various ways of reducing the costs of voting with your feet and the costs of movement as well. I mentioned some of them earlier, and I'm happy to discuss them further if there is time, which I know there may not be at this point.
In the limited time remaining, I wanted to turn it over to Dr. Gillespie. And one of the questions from the attendees, I think, was picking up on a remark that you made, that it seems as though there's some opportunity, if not an obligation, on the part of voters to search out structural reform. And I think the attendee is beginning to ask you to elaborate on that by saying, operating under the modern electoral system, many votes do not count. Do we have a responsibility to fix this rather than just voting as is or by moving?
So that's an interesting question. I'll try to answer this question and actually address some of the comments that Professor Somin kind of laid out there. I kind of want to defend regular people. So I'm not 100% convinced by, say, the Philip Converse model that, all citizens are stupid. Even when people don't know, sometimes they know enough to actually figure out sort of the general direction and what they think. And so I guess I'm more persuaded by John Zoller than I am by Philip Converse. And so I think we need to give people the opportunity, one, to make mistakes and to learn from those mistakes. And we also need to give people the opportunity to update, perhaps even in a Bayesian sense, so that as they acquire new information that they might be able to adjust their opinions and their preferences. The other thing that I think is actually really important to keep in mind is that sometimes what people perceive as ignorance is actually self-interest that's being manifest. So especially if people are holding prejudiced points of view, sometimes it's not because they are ignorant of others or ignorant of history, though I want to combat that as much as possible. Sometimes they know fully well what they're doing, and it's just in their racialized self-interest to behave in ways that are harmful to other people. And I think we should acknowledge that and make distinctions between that, right? Or we should challenge feigned ignorance. So I don't believe that Donald Trump doesn't know who David Duke is and didn't know who he was in 2016. That's just unfathomable to me for somebody, who was born in the 1940s, who had to live through the, 80s the way I did. And if I am the same age as Donald Trump Jr. and I know who David Duke is, then I expect Donald Trump Sr. to know who he is. So I think we have to sort of, acknowledge that. But to answer the question, citizens have a responsibility to demand change from their government to tweak it. I don't believe the Constitution was supposed to be bathed in amber and thus sort of this fixed thing. There are things that may not work right, and in a policy feedback, we go back and try to fix things that are different. And so if we are, or that are not working, and so if we find that there's something that isn't working right, then perhaps we find out that people have figured out loopholes and are now walking through those loopholes. Perhaps it's our responsibility to urge our elected officials to tighten them up, to close those loopholes, to try to make things fair. That's a really important part of structural fairness. It would be nice to be able to delegate everything to elected officials and not actually sort of pay attention to what's going on. But democracy requires active citizenship if it is going to function. And I think the things that Professor Evans pointed out, which are, sobering and yet completely timely in this moment, are things that we've allowed to happen because we have not held people accountable. We haven't used those levers that are at our disposal to make sure that they are more responsive to our interests and less responsive to things that might be self-interested or that are actually going to push us in illiberal directions.
Dr. Gillespie, thanks for that remark. We have gone over our time, so I regret that we are out of time. And let me thank all of our panelists, Drs. Gillespie and Evans and Professor Somin, for joining us today and providing us this great opportunity to reflect on this enduring issue about how we should understand the opportunities and responsibilities we might have to participate politically. Thank you all again. And thank you all for attending, and we wish you all well. Bye.
Thank you.